Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of my series on Druid meditation. And we've been looking at the history of the British Isles and also sort of Western Europe, and covering the fact that the Druids were part of that whole Celtic society which stretched all the way from the west of France, modern day Brittany, what was Gaul, back in a couple of thousand years ago under the time of the Romans, and how when the Roman Empire really sort of got full swing, most of the Celts and certainly the Druid leaders as well were sort of pushed back into onto the British Isles, and then we looked at how after the Roman invasion, they set about more or less taking out all of the Druids, and we see the culmination of this when the island of Anglesey is besieged, and the Roman army goes in there eventually and massacres the most of the Druids. The only ones that escaping would be sort of stragglers who would probably go underground. And we know that the Druid tradition continued, so that was certainly something that would have happened. Those who could obviously escape from the Romans' clutches. But what I wanted to talk to you about today in this particular episode is the big difference between the Celtic culture and the spirituality of the Druids as opposed to Roman culture and their take on religion and how they saw that. And I emphasise the word religion rather than spirituality. So I would say that what the word that epitomises the attitude of the Druids in the Celtic society was that of service. So we've got, on the one hand, we've got the Druids and what I would classify a life of service to their community, to their beliefs, to the environment, to the land in which they lived, and to their traditions, which were oral traditions, as we saw before, that they were passed down very rigidly from one generation of Druids to the next. So we have this kind of service attitude, all to act as servants in the community that they live. On the other hand, we have the empire being the Roman Empire. And we saw the first attack upon the British Isles was led by the armies of Julius Caesar at the helm of that attack, which was unsuccessful. But later on, under Emperor Claudius, the next attack was successful, in that the Roman invasion came in like a bit of a steamroller, really, with an army of sort of 50 to 100,000. We're not exactly sure, but around somewhere in that region. Certainly tens of thousands, high tens of thousands of soldiers came in and gradually pushed their way across the British Isles. Now, the Roman ethos was to take other countries, to build an empire, and that was very much was the way that they saw the world. It was theirs for the taking. They followed a lot of the examples of the Greek Empire and Alexander the Great's sort of example of going out there and sort of taking these different countries. And but the Romans had a special weapon amongst other weapons that they had. I mean, they had an incredibly strong army in the day, it was sort of second to none. It was kind of cutting edge, really. If you think of sort of the technology today, they were right up there with, they were the superpower of the day. Their army were very well trained, very well disciplined, and their captains and their centurions stood for no nonsense whatsoever. Any insubordination was punished by summary execution, for instance, and it was a very brutal system, but they were incredibly well disciplined as an army. And this was the main tool of the empire. The army was used to pursue that effort of taking more and more and more lands and countries. So they'd already subdued most of Europe, Western Europe certainly, and North Africa. They'd gone down into as far as Egypt. They'd conquered that as well. And pushing further west across Europe, the British Isles stood as the last sort of stronghold of the Celts. Now, as I mentioned, the one particular secret weapon of the Romans was propaganda. And propaganda, we know today, certainly since the 20th century, is a weapon that's been used very effectively by dictators, by authoritarian regimes such as the fascists, the Nazis, the communists in different parts of the world have used these types of propaganda. We could argue other cultures have used them as well, but in different ways. I've even heard an argument that a lot of the films that come out of Hollywood are a kind of propaganda. I'm not saying all of them, because there's some fine art that comes out of those echelons, of course, as well. But for a long time, we had a system whereby Hollywood was censored and certain things came out of there. And you could argue the fact that it was almost a sort of a propaganda as to this is the lifestyle that we should be living in the West, the free world, etc. And other parts of the world looked at that, and possibly the communists, and said, this is Western propaganda, etc. So I'm sure that in the British Empire we used forms of propaganda as well. But this became a tool of empire sort of from the Romans onwards. So what do I mean by propaganda? Well, I've probably mentioned before some of the stories that came out about the Celts and about the Druids in particular were quite blatant propaganda. Now, we had stories about things like ritual execution, human sacrifices by the Druids, and as I said, it's not impossible that sacrifices were carried out by certain Druids. It's not impossible that they were complicit in summary killings of people for different reasons. It's not impossible, but for Julius Caesar to remark that the Britons were particularly barbaric and the Druids were a barbaric religion, a barbaric belief system that did these things, was a little bit thick, because we're talking here about a culture in Rome which was amongst the most barbaric, violent and horrific in terms of how human beings treated other human beings. We've probably all heard about the Roman games and the Colosseums, how people were fighting to the death amidst massive kind of football stadium size audiences, for the pleasure of the rich and powerful of Rome, of course. Men fighting to the death, people fighting for their lives against animals. They had one particular wonderful contraption which was like a seesaw, where they would attach so many prisoners to one end of the seesaw, and so many prisoners were chained to the other end. And when it moved across its fulcrum, some of the men were in the air, some of them were on the ground. And then at this point, a host of lions and other big cats, which had been deliberately starved for a period of time, were then released into the Colosseum, and would then obviously attack and try to tear apart the prisoners, who would be leaping into the air to try to tip the pendulum. But of course, inevitably, they would all be mauled to death, eaten, etc. And it would be a slow and painful death. Another example of punishment of Roman prisoners was to sew them inside a leather bag with various other animals like snakes and dogs and rats and things like that. Sew them inside this bag and drop them into the river. So they would die a slow death, of either by drowning or being attacked by these various animals, which were also drowning as well. This was considered a punishment for prisoners, if you like. And there was definitely this element of spitefulness that the Romans had towards anybody that they captured. And certainly anybody that attacked them, it wasn't just a matter of, we'll take your country, subdue you, and you'll come under our control. It was, we will hunt down anybody that has been any opposition to us whatsoever, and we will summarily execute them. And they had some wonderful, I say wonderful, some horrific forms of torture. We know about crucifixion. Crucifixion had been used in many parts of the world, but the Romans made it into an art form where they would crucify sometimes hundreds or even thousands of prisoners, and they would do them very publicly along roadsides across the Roman Empire. And it was an incredibly slow and painful means of killing people, where they were nailed to crosses, and their death was very slow and very painful. They either suffocated, their limbs were pulled out of joint, their internal organs collapsed, etc., etc. It was not a quick means of execution by all means, and we know this is almost sort of seeped into our culture, but we sometimes don't realise how horrific and how painful that was. It was intended to be as slow and as painful as possible. So, by comparison, somebody who would just be quickly decapitated or run through with the sword, that was a merciful way of killing. The Romans didn't particularly like merciful forms of killing. But back to Britain and the Druids. So for a Druid, if you can imagine a culture, so the Romans considered us to be barbarians, and they considered us to be sort of savages, really, and the Druids were the ones who were pulling these strings, if you like. And yes, the Druids were high-ranking and very respected members of the community. A Druid would take at least 20 years to train a Druid, because the Druid would need to memorize all of the oral traditions. They would learn about the astrology, astronomy. They would learn about nature, ecology. They would learn all the stories and poems, etc., tales from the culture which had been passed down. They would learn about magic. They would learn about herbalism. They would learn about the various ceremonies that they took part in, and they would learn how to lead the people, the Celtic people, in their forms of ceremonial worship, which would take place in the groves, which are the clearings in the forest, largely, and also some of the stone structures, stone cathedrals, with such as Stonehenge Avebury and places like that. They were very revered in community because all of this training, they were learned, and they were not, in spite of some of the inferences, they were not illiterate at all. It was just that their traditions were seen as so important and so profound that they didn't trust the writing down of these traditions, and which for us today is a shame, because we don't have any written writings. We only have really information about the Druids, which comes from people like their rivals, like the Romans, various different Roman writers like Julius Caesar and Tacitus and people like that, who wrote down accounts of what the Romans were. But as I say, we have to bear in mind the fact that propaganda was a massive tool in Rome. Now the Romans had experience and seen the Druids in Gaul as well, and they'd seen how they managed to organise the people. Now these Druids were not just priests, but they were also acted as judges. They acted as arbiters between the tribes, keeping peace. So the Romans' way of stopping an insurrection or trouble or any kind of uprising at all, which they demonstrated very graphically all across their empire, from the Middle East right to Britain, to the north, down to the south in Africa as well. Any argument, any insurrection whatsoever, any insubordination to the emperor, to the army, to the generals, to the general Roman way of life was punished very, very strongly in these terms, with these executions, etc. And they thought nothing of massacring whole groups, whole tribes of people. Genocide was another tool that they used, where they would go in and they would wipe out a whole culture or civilization. If you look at somewhere like the Carthaginians on the southern part, the north of Africa, their great empire, then the Romans set about, after defeating them, to wiping out every trace of their culture. And they would burn records, they would burn libraries, books and everything. They would seek to completely destroy that culture. This was the Roman way, and they found that this worked very well to their advantage. So when I was at school, we were taught about the Romans, but we were usually encouraged to look at things like their wonderful feats of engineering and technological advances. Of course, they developed these wonderful roads, which were built, which were the best roads that were made, certainly until probably the 18th or even the 19th century. Very, very well engineered indeed. But there was one reason for building the roads, and that was so that the armies could move swiftly and ruthlessly across the continent and across the various lands that the Roman Empire conquered. So it was a quick way to move those armies, so they could take carts, they could march troops, and very effectively, much more quickly than going through sort of rough terrain, etc. So that was one. All the wonderful Roman roads, fantastic. They were not built for our benefit in Britain. They weren't built for the benefit of the other European countries that the Romans conquered, etc. They were built as a military tool. Central heating, it's very much lauded, the wonderful Roman central heating. Again, it was rich and powerful, privileged Romans who had the benefit of something like central heating, which they probably used to great effect when they came to the colder climates of the north, such as the British Isles. But it certainly wasn't something that ordinary people in Britain ever benefited from. In fact, probably most people in the British Isles didn't didn't get anything like central heating in their homes until probably the sort of towards the very end of the 20th century. That's the effect that had on us. I could talk about aqueducts bringing fresh water in and things like that. Again, none of these things were for the benefit of the ordinary people who were considered as peasants at best. They loved to utilise slave labour, of course, and slavery was a big thing. A large proportion of those conquered by the Romans were taken as slaves. And if they weren't killed because of their particular importance or insurrection, then the well-behaved ones would probably become slaves and live a pretty squalid and hard, torturous life, possibly building roads, aqueducts, you name it. So this was the way generally that the Romans treated those who they conquered. So society in the Celtic society, and so we're going back there a couple of thousand years, and we're looking at a society that's built up of various tribes that go across the British Isles, and there are many different chieftains or princes or kings, queens, etc. of these different lands, and keeping the peace between these would be the Druids, because they were respected. So if there was an argument and a skirmish between one tribe and another, which obviously did happen, battles took place occasionally, but many times the Druids would step in and make the peace and arbitrate between these different groups of people. So we don't know exactly what the Druids were like and what they did, but we can see the pattern of life around the British Isles at the time, and we can certainly see that when the Romans came in with their imperialistic empire building violent invasion of the British Isles, that this was not good news for the people that lived here by any means at all. So the Druids encouraged the people spiritually. So there was a general understanding that we as human beings are part of nature, we are part of the environment, we're part of the ecosystem. They understood the flow of energy that flows through us, and I spoke about the Arwen being that energy that flows up through the earth and flows through us all, flows through all living things, flows through rivers, flows through the mountains, flows through the wind, flows through our bodies, our blood, our breath, etc. And they understood this, and the whole society of the Celts was not an isolated one. We were not a bunch of savages that lived in these isolated islands or enclaves on the continent of Gaul and Brittany and places like that. We were a network of Celtic tribes and peoples who traded peacefully as far as the Middle East. We know that people were coming from the Middle East for thousands of years, coming to the British Isles for our resources such as tin and iron, and certainly knowledge from Druidry. You can find elements passed through into other cultures as well, and it did travel. And in the same way, a lot of the wisdom from the Eastern traditions, obviously, in the same way, was reflected in how the Druids studied, and they would have studied some of these other traditions, as is borne out by the fact that a lot of the traditions in Druidry are very similar to traditions that are found in the Vedic traditions of India or the Taoist traditions of China, etc. We can see that there was definitely a cross-pollination of spiritual beliefs across this area. So the point that I'm trying to make with this really is to just say to you that we have two different types of culture here. Now, towards the end of the 20th century, we'd had so many wars and we'd had so much imperialism. We'd had so many different empires trying to take control one after the other. I mean, the British Empire was the biggest empire that the world ever saw. In some ways, the proponents of that empire were imperialists, and some of them did look even to the Roman pattern of how they conquered, etc. But in a lot of ways, it was not such a barbaric empire. But then we had others, such as Hitler, who emulated very much the Roman Empire. He himself wanted to build a 1,000-year Reich, in other words, a rule of 1,000 years, which was direct reference to the Roman Empire, which lasted around about 1,000 years before its collapse in sort of the 4th, 5th centuries AD. So what we find is this culture which has so much in common with a lot of the spiritual traditions in the world. And then we have the Roman example. Now, if I can go back to religion, what the Romans generally did, and what's generally kind of understood, is that the countries that they went into, they saw the religions that were there, and they saw how people in those cultures were influenced by them. In some ways, the Romans were superstitious and they took on other gods, such as the gods of the Greeks. And there were sort of Roman cults where they would follow particular types of gods, etc. But the general consensus was that the emperor and the empire was above everything. They emulated, when a Roman emperor, the Caesar, passed away, when he died, he was elevated to the status of a god or a demigod. And this particular system sort of outweighed any other religious system. So they went along and they gleaned little bits from different religions. Any particular faith that stood against the Roman way of doing things. So if we take Judaism, for instance, when the Romans invaded the Middle East, the area that's now Israel, was Judea at the time, they encountered a lot of hostility from the people, because they had a fiercely monotheistic religion. Judaism was fiercely monotheistic, and they would not accept other gods, because their scriptures told them that there was only one God, and to have any other idols or have any other gods at all was completely abhorrent to them. And there was a great amount of rebellion towards Roman rule there, and the Romans punished quite strongly the people there, but they tried in certain ways to work alongside, and certain members of that society there in Judea did become sympathetic to the Romans, and they did work alongside them. While they were able to do that, it wasn't too bad. When it got to a point of too much rebellion, then we see the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem eventually, in which was not that long after the massacre of the Druids and Angles. Actually, it's around about sort of 70 AD, I think. Correct me if I'm not. Don't shoot me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I think it was around about 70 AD. And so they kind of finally put an end to that because of how it was. But very interestingly, the Romans looked at the Druids and they saw the influence that they had over the Celtic tribes of the British Isles, and certainly in Gaul as well. And they knew that these people were influencing the people spiritually, and their spirituality was important to them. It wasn't a sort of a superstition, it was that overall understanding of what it is to be a being in nature, how they understood this kind of non-dualistic view of the world, where we are a part of nature, nature is a part of us, and we are all one. So, and that this obviously had a big impact on the people. And when the Romans came in and wanted to stamp this out, the Druids did stand in their way, and they did sort of rally the people around themselves. So the Romans decided to get rid of that, but in their usual way, they went to stamp out everything they could. They cut down the groves, they destroyed as much as they could of the whole Druid system, and what was left would have gone into hiding, as I said. But the Romans went on, of course, towards the end of the Roman Empire, and it was finally dying out. They convened, and they looked at how they could use religion to unite what was left of the empire, and this was the point at which they took on an organised religion, which the state adopted eventually, and this was Christianity. But this form of Christianity in itself was very much centred around the empire system, the people being subservient to this system of rule by kings, and God being at the top, then it filtering down to the emperor, etc., or later on who became the Pope, and we had a whole system of hierarchy. I'm not going to go into it in any depth today because it's a massive topic. But the Romans knew how to use religion in their favour, and they knew how to use it to keep people under control. And so the parts of the writings that became the Bible that were particularly emphasised were the bits about pay your dues to Caesar, obey your authorities, those who rule those who rule over you have been placed there by God, etc., etc. They were very misogynistic. Some of the teachings of this new religion that was founded, and so it was all men ruling everything, whereas opposed to the Druids, who were male and female, there was no. And in fact, across Celtic society, men and women could both be in positions of authority, which was unprecedented in most of the world at the time. Most certainly in Europe, it was unprecedented that men and women could both be in positions of power. In fact, in Rome itself, a wife was considered to be the legal property of her husband, and she had no value of her own. She certainly, when we talk about Rome having a democracy, that's a little bit of a misnomer in itself, really, because it was certain privileged men who were able to exercise the vote or ascend to the Senate, etc. Women were not included in that at all, whereas in the system that we have under the Druids, there is this equality and an understanding which, very much like Taoism, which understands that there is a male and a female, the Druids understood this, and the Druids would have understood, looking at nature, the fact that everything has a male and a female element, and nature cannot flourish without male and female. You can't have trees pollinating themselves from one sex. You have to have two. You have to have a male and a female, etc. Plants, animals, everything is male and female, and we see this also, of course, in the cultures of India as well, where we have the male gods and the female goddesses, and we have the interaction of those two and the interplay between them. We have the various energies, which are male and female energies. So the Romans wanted to perpetuate this misogynistic, very paternal, male orientated worldview. So they needed a god who was a male god, a male father figure, and the religion they eventually espoused was one that was kind of based on a lot of different religions in the world, but to fit their own ends, to keep obedience to the emperor, to keep obedience to the empire. And it was not to further the spiritual development of the people, but it was to keep them subdued and suppressed. Whereas we see in the Celtic society that there really was a connection between man and nature. And so when I bring this up to date and I look at the world today, I see that there are still powers that want to exercise their authority in the world, that want to dominate, that want to invade other countries, take control of them, build empires. And even today we have usually we have empires and civilizations that are very, very male dominated, and these are the ones that are pushing forward to try to control the planet. Sometimes it's militarily, sometimes it's economically, but there's a sense that we don't have enough, we need more, we need more, we need more. And just like Rome, where the top 1% controlled, I think it was about 16% of the wealth of Rome. Today we have a small group of billionaire, trillionaire controllers who control the vast majority of the wealth of the planet. And we have countries that, just like the Romans, spent 60% of their GDP on defence and their army and their military. We have nations today that spend a vast proportion of their money on that, even to the point of getting in debt. And this was one of the causes of the eventual downfall of Rome, the fact that they got more and more and more in debt. Money became devalued, and eventually the empire fell from within, as we know the stories. But there is a different way. There is a different way. The way that I follow as a meditator and as someone who tries to follow the spiritual path that's been passed down for thousands of years is to respect life, to respect others, to not see myself as being more important, or to see my country, my nation, as being more important than any other nation. I don't look at myself and think, what more can I take for myself? How can I get richer? How can I have more possessions? How can I take more from others and put it into my own bank? How can I make my empire bigger? And I find that generally those of you who are on this spiritual path with me are generally people that understand things like kindness and compassion and selflessness and service. So as I mentioned at the start, the Druids understood a life of service. It didn't mean that they were everybody's rubbing rag, certainly not. They were highly esteemed because of what they did, but they offered a service and they took it seriously. They trained for 20 years, they learnt all of the traditions, and they served the people under them. They were not emperors, they were not kings, they were not rulers who commanded obedience from their subjects and subdued, suppressed and slaughtered them if they disagreed with them. So this is how really we should go forward in the world today, in my opinion. I'm not being political, I'm just saying that to continue to keep on striving for more and more, be greedier and greedier, to want more and more millions and billions or trillions of our currency, or to want more acres and hectares and miles and square kilometres of the planet, to snatch them off other indigenous populations, to subdue them, to force our will on them, to force our customs upon them, to try to make them like us, clones of us, is not the way of nature at all. The way of nature is to flow, just as Taoism sees a flow of the Tao. The action of water which flows from the highest point down to the lowest point. We're not to seek the highest point. We're not to seek that position of control and subjugation of others. So for me, when I sit down to meditate, I have these things in mind. I can take an example from our ancestors from thousands of years ago, whether they were here in the British Isles, whether they were in India, whether they were in China, Nepal, Tibet, parts of Africa, Australia. We see many, many cultures, far more cultures, who understood that being a part of nature, being at one with nature, living in harmony with the world around us, that was how we really got to the heart of what spirituality is all about: awakening, enlightenment, and the truth. So I hope this makes sense. As I say, I'm not trying to be political, I'm not trying to be religious, I'm just trying to show a contrast of two different worldviews here. If you found this interesting, then maybe give us a thumbs up. If you have any comments that you'd like to make, anything that you'd like to add from your own experience or your own viewpoint, I'm always happy to listen to your comments, so please do share. If you found this enjoyable and you'd like to hear more, then do consider subscribing to this channel as well. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much, and I will speak to you again very soon. Until then, namaskaram.